I have a really strange hobby. I love reading what's written on gravestones. And I'm going to give you some examples, and I promise you these are absolutely true. There's a coal miner's grave, and it says on it, "Gone underground for good." In Scotland, there's a dentist's grave with this on it: "Stranger, tread this ground with gravity. Dentist Brown is filling his last cavity." You can guess this one on an auctioneer's grave. Going, gone. On a waiter's grave, "God finally caught his eye." My all-time favourite is the comedian Spike Milligan. You may well have heard this. It says, "I told you I was ill." Well, my pastor was telling me that he had a dream. And in his dream, he saw what he thought was his own gravestone. And it was carrying the inscription, "He failed to live up to expectations." And it made him realise just how conditioned he was to try and live up to expectations rather than to give and to serve simply out of love, which is where we ended up last time. He said it was a struggle to come out of that way of thinking, but when he did, in his words, liberation was sweet. So he failed to live up to expectations. Many of us walk around with the sense that we are failing miserably as sons and daughters of a living God. We try really hard to live up to the standards that we feel we should, but we fall short. And so we can end up in a near permanent state of beating ourselves up. We find it impossible sometimes to feel good unless we perform perfectly, which of course we never ever do.
I think we're coming to see that God's way of living is the totally opposite of what we normally would think. So, if all this grace stuff sounds strange to you, don't worry, you'll get used to it. And you'll eventually find it's absolutely the coolest way to live. I remember my first trip to the UK. It took some getting used to that the driver of the car is on the right side of the vehicle, in the right front seat. I'm used to the driver being in the left front seat. I remember one time seeing this car coming towards me, and seated in the left front seat of that car, standing all prim and proper, this huge dog. And I looked, my gosh, that dog's driving the car. The Brits have their dogs driving. Well, driving was really scary for me when I first tried it in the UK. I remember everything being absolutely counterintuitive. I was sitting in the right front seat instead of the left. I was shifting gears with my left hand instead of my right. I was driving on the wrong side of the road. All right, the left side of the road. And turning corners was the exact opposite of what I would do in the States. I mean, I got so stressed out, I actually got sick because of that. It was so hard for me. But after a couple weeks, it became second nature. Now, why do I share that? Well, because if you feel a little bit that way about God's grace, almost like it's like trying to write with your offhand. You know, it's different. It's difficult sometimes at first. And many people have a hard time getting their minds around it. That God's unconditional love and acceptance is really true. Grace living at first can seem really, really strange to us. The exact opposite of what we're used to. And sadly, guilt living can actually come to feel in a weird way kind of normal. In that same study that we did and mentioned in our last session from the Barna Research Group, amazingly, almost 60% of the Christians surveyed in the United States admitted that they believe they do not live up to God's expectations of them. 60%. In other words, more than half of the believers in the United States are living what I would say with a low-grade fever of guilt. Now, the problem with a life filled with guilt is that you can become either like the younger brother or the older brother. As the younger brother, you end up with an increasingly wasted life, or as the older brother, you try harder to work off the guilt. The motivation for your efforts in that situation is to avoid sin and do good in a futile effort to somehow gain or maintain God's love and favor, rather than first resting in the unconditional love of God and being motivated by his love to serve. In his letter to the Galatians, you can almost hear the Apostle Paul's exasperation, crying out to God's people, "What has happened to all your joy?" Maybe you're asking yourself the same question. What's happened to my joy? See, I remember a time shortly after I became a Christian when I felt really guilty. It was my 19th birthday. I was at the university. And even though I knew it was wrong, I was getting drunk anyway with my buddies. We were having a party. My buddies didn't care. But all of a sudden, one of my friends burst into the room where we were having our drinking party and announced the shocking news: "Your brother is coming." It was like the Apostle Paul was walking down the hall, because my brother had led me to Christ. I remember him walking into the room, and before that I'm trying to make myself look really sober, good try, putting the bottle behind me and all that kind of stuff. And I could see immediately he knew what was going on. There was this deep, sad, disappointed look on his face. He had come to give me my birthday present, and I knew I was in trouble. It was a book. And I opened it. It was The Master Plan of Evangelism by Robert Coleman. I wanted to crawl into a hole.
Rich asked me when we were preparing this if I had any experiences to share of feeling guilty in the past, especially as a young Christian. And I just said, I always felt guilty. When I first became a Christian, I did kind of feel that when I coming into God's presence, I was like a little worm crawling in. And I was kind of beat myself up, Lord. I know I'm not worthy, Lord, to come here. Thank you for your forgiveness. And there was very little joy. There was very little joy. And I don't think that's an atypical experience. Now, what is guilt? Well, we tend to think of guilt as primarily a feeling, as in, I feel really guilty for saying that. When in fact, true guilt has nothing to do with feelings. It's about hard facts. It's a legal term used in a courtroom where a judge or a jury, after hearing the facts of the case, comes to a decision that the charge against the defendant is true, and they pronounce him guilty. So guilt is defined in relation to the legal authority which has laid down the laws. If we break the laws of that legal authority, we are guilty. If we don't, we're innocent. You remember the two robbers that were crucified on either side of Jesus? This is what it says in the Gospel account. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." See, the second robber knew that both he and the first robber were guilty before the law of the land, the legal authority, and that the law of the land demanded physical death by crucifixion for what they'd done. In other words, they were just getting what they deserved. Although we have to remember that wasn't the end of the matter. They both had to face a higher legal authority than that, God himself, and all of us at some point must eventually give account to him. And we do know that at the very least, the two robbers had broken one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal. So they were definitely guilty, not only before the law of the land, but also before God. What if they didn't feel guilty? What if their family didn't feel they were guilty? What if the public didn't feel they were guilty? What if they committed the crime? Whatever anyone feels, they are guilty. I have something I'd like to confess to you at this point, get off my chest. Although I suspect you already know this, I'm guilty of telling really bad jokes. And it's now official. Last year, Christianity magazine published a review of the Freedom in Christ discipleship course and the teaching DVD that I presented. They were really quite positive about the course, but they had these little sections, high point and low point, in the review. And I just want to tell you what they said in the low point. It said, and I quote, "Steve Goss's jokes are possibly some of the worst you'll ever hear. But he somehow pulls them off." It was my Facebook status for some time. Now, Let's see if you agree with that. There was a guy watching a movie, and he noticed as the movie went on that sitting on the seat in front of him was a dog. He was quite surprised by that. Anyway, he was even more surprised as he started watching the dog because it was a comedy film, and he noticed that the dog was laughing in all the right places. Well, the film ended, and he couldn't resist just talking to the owner of the dog, and he said, "Do you always bring your dog to the movies? It's a kind of strange thing to do." And the owner said, "Oh, he really loves coming. We come once a week." And the guy said, "That's just intriguing." He said, "But what was really surprising to me was he seemed to be laughing in all the right places." And the owner said, "To tell you the truth, I was quite surprised by that as well. He hated the book."
Yes, Steve, guilty as charged. Yes, you are. Well, so there's a distinction between true guilt and guilt feelings. They're not the same thing. True guilt, as we said, is a matter of facts, not a question of our feelings. Our guilt feelings, or the lack of them, are not a reliable guide to whether we're truly guilty or not. So, what about you and me? Are we guilty? Do we have true guilt? See, we may be law-abiding citizens, innocent before the laws of the land, but where do we stand before our heavenly judge? Now, before we can answer that question, we need to remind ourselves of just who God is. You can't really appreciate, I'm convinced, God's grace without somehow grasping at some level God's holiness. God is holy. In fact, the Old Testament often refers to him as holy, holy, holy. The word repeated 3 times for emphasis, the mind-boggling extent of his holiness that we can't even begin to grasp, really. Now, I hope you like the nice PowerPoint drawings and illustrations we've had in this course. Our illustrator's done a great job with that. But when we asked him to come up with an illustration of God's holiness, he couldn't do it. See, the trouble is we simply can't get our minds fully around the holiness of God. This is what the great author A.W. Tozer had to say about that. We cannot grasp the true meaning of the divine holiness by thinking of someone or something very pure and then raising the concept to the highest degree we're capable of. God's holiness is not simply the best we know infinitely bettered. We know nothing like the divine holiness. It stands apart, unique, unapproachable, incomprehensible, and unattainable. Now, one thing we do know about God's holiness, it is such that it would be absolutely impossible for him to tolerate sin, to sweep it under the rug, so to speak, to say he didn't think it mattered. He wouldn't be God if he did that.
That's right. And when God created the universe and this earth and human beings, in a sense, there was a big question. Would he make us as robots that had to obey, where in effect he held a remote control in his hand and it would be impossible for us to pick up a hammer and hit somebody, impossible to do wrong? Or would he give us the ability to make genuine choices, despite the risk that that would lead to sin, which he couldn't abide, and we would therefore not be able to stay in his presence? Well, God's choice was to give us free will. And I don't think he spent a long time agonizing about that. So our ancestor, Adam, was created perfect and innocent, yet with the capacity to choose good or evil. God didn't burden him, by the way, with a whole load of rules and regulations. In fact, what God said to Adam and Eve was, you can do anything you want. Just one thing, don't eat from that tree over there, because if you do, it'll harm you and other people. Well, Eve, deceived by Satan, did eat from the tree, and her husband Adam chose to disobey God. And that disobedience is the essence of what the Bible calls sin. And the Apostle Paul tells us the consequences of sin. Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So Adam incurred true guilt before God because he'd broken God's law, and there were those enormous consequences. He was cut off from relationship with God. He was cast out of his presence, and then there was that death. He lost the spiritual life that he'd been given when God created him. Now, here's an interesting point. In many languages, the words for sin and debt are the same. It's the same word. It's the same word in Greek. And that's why sometimes you find translators of the Lord's Prayer saying, forgive us our sins, and others prefer, forgive us our debts. Either way, it's helpful to understand that when you sin, you actually do incur a debt to God. See, if you are found guilty before a human court, you incur a debt. It demands payment, and that's usually in the form of a financial penalty, a fine, or time served out in prison. But once you have done that, once you've paid your money or you've served your time, you are again declared not guilty of that crime. It's paid for. And we often use the concept of scales to symbolize justice. And in the heavenly courts of justice, sin, our guilt for sin, weighs down one side, and so payment needs to be made on the other side until they're both level again. What about Adam? Well, he had no resources to pay the debt that he'd incurred to God. There's no way he could do that. And so, in effect, it was passed down to the next generation, who also couldn't pay. And it's come all the way down to us. See, talking about Adam, Paul says this: by the one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. In other words, when Adam sinned, one of the consequences is that you and I and all the rest of Adam's descendants were made guilty before God too, with true guilt. Now that takes a little bit of getting your mind around, doesn't it? Just by way of illustration, think about the national debt of your country. I remember on the day that it was announced that the national debt of the UK had exceeded $1 trillion for the first time. I have no idea how many zeros that is. But on that day, our newspapers and our TV channels worked out that every British citizen owed the equivalent of £16,400. That's over 26,000 US dollars. Now imagine a baby being born that day, through no fault of its own, but just because of the overspending of earlier generations. In effect, it immediately had a debt of £16,400. That's kind of the way it works with Adam and what he did. We all experience guilt, but often we don't express it or understand it. But talking about guilt can often be the first step to getting rid of it, which is what God truly desires for you.